year of the Parayana series, but this is the second presentation in the second set of 13. When I began to design educational courses in the mid-1960s in San Francisco, the semester was always 13 presentations, which is a quarter of a year. And it was a time-honored form from the time of the Renaissance, when the first universities would have the arts and sciences together. And so I'm old enough to have begun that way, and so I keep that honorary form. It is interesting now because we're getting into deeper water. The first 13 presentations were an introduction of the way in which about 1,000 years ago, a millennia ago, there was an immense change that happened in the European world. The year 1000 was recognized as being the millennial year. And so time forms in terms of ages is so indelible in civilization that especially in the medieval times, one got the sense that there was an apocalyptic panic. And indeed, one of the great books on that whole era and its repercussions was by Norman Cohen, called In Pursuit of the Millennium. And Cohen lived to be 93, and right at the end of his life, after a distinguished career, his last book was about the missing wedge in Western appreciation of civilization, and that was the work of Zarathustra. And as some of you may know, I spent about 10 years making assiduously a translation of Zarathustra's original gathas into not just English and not just American English, but into a 21st century American English poetic, which is now going to be made available through our publishing, Shared Presence Press. One of the sets of books that very early on for me in the late 1950s at the University of Wisconsin were two paper bounds that came out, and at that time in university bookstores, paperbacks were sorted according to publisher. All of the Anchor paperbacks were together, all of the Dover together, all of the Penguins together, etc. And in one of the shelves, I noticed a book that stuck out, and its title was Answer to Job by Carl Jung, C.G. Jung. And that paper edition had a green spine. I remember holding it in my hand and kind of a blackish cover with some designs on it. And I happened to have enough money to buy a copy. And I tried to read Carl Jung's Answer to Job, and it was just completely beyond me. And about 2-3 years later, when I had put a lot of time in, I had a double major, so I had to go 5 years to the University of Wisconsin. And I began to understand that I could read a little bit of Jung's Answer to Job. I returned to it, and I remember the day that I returned to it, I went down to the University of Wisconsin bookstore, and I found a book in the drama books section called The Book of Job as a Greek Tragedy. And I bought a copy of that paperback. It's still available through Amazon, if you look up the Book of Job is a Greek Tragedy by Horace M. Callan, you'll find many editions and copies of it. Unfortunately, not the original paperback. The Book of Job became, for me, at that point, a portal that these two pillars, and I didn't know why at the time that they meant a lot to me, but I can say today, some almost half a century later, that they're extraordinary. The Answer to Job is reprinted by Princeton University Press in Princeton took over the publishing from Pantheon Books a long, long time ago, decades ago, the Bollingen series. And the Bollingen series was a series that was made possible by the hundreds of millions of dollars of the Mellon Foundation, Paul and Mary Mellon. And it was interesting because Mary Mellon was psychically active and not as a channeler or anything like that, but she was able to have very, very profound dreams and interests, quite an extraordinary woman. And she applied by courier to Carl Jung in Zurich to become a patient of his. And Jung, by that time, was world famous. This is in the late 1930s. And he said, I have no place, I have no time, I have no room. And so Paul Mellon, being the inheritor of this huge fortune, took Mary, and they took a hotel in Zurich and also a country house rental in Küsnacht, which is a suburb of Zurich on the lake. And they began to show up almost every day, literally on the doorstep of Carl Jung. And finally, he relented, but he said, part of my fee is not for money. I have plenty of that, but I would like to see a publishing company set up to publish books which are not in print, which will have trouble being in print. And so the Mellons set up the Bollingen Foundation right at the beginnings of the 1940s. And the first volume was published in 1943. And it eventually ran to 100 volumes, as not just individual volumes, but sometimes whole sets. And one of the sets is still being published. It's the Mellon Lectures in Fine Arts. And it must run to 50-some volumes, almost 60 volumes now. So the collected works of Jung, Carl Jung, is volume 20 of that Bollingen series, and there are about 20 volumes, and they update it every so many years. So the excerpt of many important books by him is put out in paper editions. And so the Answer to Job by Carl Jung is one of those. The book, this is the first edition from 1918 of Horace Callan's The Book of Job is a Greek Tragedy. And it was incredibly researched and written. And it is very, very poignant. And putting these two books together, the Book of Job finally is able to be shown to be a portal into a wonderland. Because one has to understand not only what Jung's Answer to Job is all about, and what Horace Callan's The Book of Job is a Greek Tragedy is all about. And with Callan and with Jung, one widens that portal to something where you enter into a charismatic, multidimensional wonderland of cosmic proportions. One of the aspects that we're going to talk about today is that no one knows who the book of Job's author is, but I do. And so we're going to talk about the author of the book of Job, who also is one of the great, almost unsung, unheard of, world-class authors. In fact, not just world-class, but cosmic-class authors of our species on this planet. The author was born in Alexandria about, say, 235 BC. Was a Jew, but an extremely educated, well-versed Jew, not a rabbinic Jew. There was no rabbinic Judaism at that time at all. And the old Judaism, the Torah-holding based Judaism, which was always under criticism by the prophets. All of the prophetic works, the 12 great prophets, are critical of those who hold to the Torah as being the metronome, the index, the judgment base of how then Judaism is to be understood. And all of this is a sideshow that can be understood and has been understood by many persons of genius, and especially in Alexandria at that time, and in the United States at our time, starting in the 1940s and going up to date. One of the most powerful sets in the Bollingen series is 13 volumes. And those 13 volumes are entitled, overall, Hellenistic Judaism in its heyday, the symbols and everything. E.R. Goodenough, Goodnoughh, was a professor at Yale. And his symbols in Hellenistic Judaism was a revival of the understanding that Hellenistic Judaism, centered in Alexandria, was so powerful at the time that it wasn't just about Judaism, but broadcast through the immense dynamic, the power, the intelligence, the brilliance of the city of Alexandria. And by the time of about 235 BC, when our author was born, it had been about 40 years since the great Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who was in charge from his father, Ptolemy I, usually referred to as Soter, Savior. And the original Ptolemy, of course, was a lifelong friend of Alexander the Great. He's about 10 years older than Alexander. And when Alexander's father, King Philip II, decided that at about 12 years old that he would have his son, Alexander, tutored by the best available person, he found Aristotle and brought Aristotle from his Lyceum in Athens to Macedonia in the north and had him become the private tutor, not just of Alexander, but of several companions of his. And one of the 5 companions was the older Ptolemy, and Ptolemy, being a little older, was old enough already to be a military man. so that he became sort of like the upperclassman overseer of the Aristotelian tutoring of Alexander the Great and his 4 other companions. One of them was named Nearchus, and Nearchus became the admiral of Alexander the Great's navy, and several others who did not turn out so well. But it was Ptolemy who was always like the older friend, the older companion, as it were, always watching out from behind the scenes, always taking a very broad look. And because he was tutored by Alexander's favorite person, Aristotle, Ptolemy was quite educated. So after Alexander died and his empire was split among warring factions and kingdoms, Ptolemy carved out for himself not only Egypt, because of Egypt being ancient, wealthy, traditional, but because it was the site of the unbuilt yet Alexandria. It was Ptolemy who built Alexandria, who put it into architectural engineering practice, and who understood from Aristotle, from Alexander the Great, from himself, that the center of Alexandria was not the armory. It was not the palaces located in a peninsula called Lochias in Alexandria. It was the library. And powering as the pivot of the great library of Alexandria was the Museon in Greek. In Latin, it's called museum. The Museon is the temple of the muses, 9 women as a set. And the set of the 9 muses only becomes a harmonic when the 10th is added to them. The 10th is not just the addition of all of them together as a set, but it's the inclusion of Apollo, because Apollo and the 9 muses together make a perfect 10. And it is this archetypal perfect 10, a masculine sun divinity whose chariot is the sun going over the sky, whose sibling is Artemis, the huntress, Diana in Latin, who is the virgin who understands the whole aspect of hunting, not about warfare. Athena also is virginal as a goddess, but she is about warfare. Artemis is about hunting, and she is the one then that is close to Apollo. Athena is always born individually, not through the womb of some woman, but from the mind thigh of Zeus himself. Apollo and the 9 muses together then make the Museon, the pivot of the immense library of Alexandria and all of the fortunes of the empire. The different kingdoms under Alexander the Great knew that this was the closest thing to Alexander, because he was after a vision. In Greek it's called the oikumene. In Latin it's pronounced ecumene. He was after the one family of man, the family of mankind. In the 1950s there was a popular photographic book called The Family of Man, and they put it out in paper editions so everybody could have a copy of it and understand this is an idea whose time always is coming, and what is happening now in the 21st century is that the idea has been perverted into a ideological form that is characteristic of the decay of time forms when they are left in cycles. If time in civilization is left in cycles, it will always decay to tragedy. Always. It's built in because it begins with the limitation that here is the beginning of a new age, of a golden age, and that beginning is a poisoned apple. As soon as you take a bite out of limiting time in civilization to a cycle of ages, and that a new age is going to make a difference, it is exactly that new age that will putrefy first. We've seen it in our own time. We've witnessed it in our own time. And it leaves a stinking mess, which is apparent everywhere, on every level. And there's no relief in sight. And so one has to shift from sight to vision. And this is what the book of Job was written for, to shift from seeing. The translation of the Torah was ordered by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and he knew that Alexander had brought with him, even before Alexandria was marked out as going to be the new world city, the new city of the oikumene, of the family of man. Not about kingdoms, not about empires. It was about man as a species. And this was going to be it. He knew that it had to have capacities to reach out everywhere in the world. And so he brought with him, at that time, the only peoples that had 2,000 years of experience of what we today would call international trade. And that was the northern Semitic peoples. The northern Semitic peoples, under Sargon of Akkad, by about 2350 BC, had already set up a trading empire that used to be called, because it was originally called in Akkadian Sumerian, the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent went from the Persian Gulf all the way curving over to the Mediterranean Sea. And that Fertile Crescent was in shape, if you looked at it, like the Isis moon. It was the first indication that the moon in its cycle returns back from a dark moon and proceeds through its phases to a full moon. And though that full moon will become gibbous, the dark Isis moon begins with the dark shadow of the moon and increases until it is a dark moon. And if one can understand the lunar cycles as a triad, become a quaternary, become finally transformed by a pentacle, a 5-star way of looking. You go from dark of the moon all the way through full moon gibbous to the old crescent to the dark of the moon again. But the fifth, the magical fifth, the renewal, not the renewal so much as in a cycle, but the re-entry again to the light that has always been there but not been apparent. It isn't that the moon was dark, it's that the sunlight was invisible. And that the Isis moon would appear again is not the beginning of a new cycle, it's the confirmation that the invisibility can resurface into visibility. And the vision to understand that is what makes civilization. stand head, shoulders, ankles, and toes above culture. Brings the so-called supernatural into play in the natural so that it is a fertility fructifying transform, not just once but twice. It comes once through the crescent Isis. It comes twice through the full moon, which is, in ancient times, the way in which writing was first made discursive. Written language became discursive, and the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago said it was anciently true that the first person to be able to invent writing was Thoth, and that Thoth made the gift to mankind from the divine of a written language. And so one finds that in the triangle of Isis and Thoth, one begins to understand the place of Osiris. That Osiris, the god of resurrection, is triangulated because of Isis being able to encourage the weathering through the invisible, darkness seeming to the dawn of the light again, so that one understands it's not a new light, it's not a new moon. The new moon is the darkness. But it is the proof that there is a continuity of light that has never gone. It's that the light shineth, but the darkness knoweth it not. That's an ancient saying from St. John. We know today, on the internet, just yesterday, on Science Daily, the confirmation again of something that was done almost 100 years ago, actually a couple of 100 years ago. It reads, a landmark experiment on wave interference from the early 1800s is revisited using gold nanoparticles. In the 18th century, scientists faced a conundrum. Is light a wave or a particle? One of the strongest pieces of evidence to support the wave view, the landmark double-slit experiment reported in 1804 by the scientist Thomas Young. If you put two slits and introduce a light source so that those slits are so narrow, the light coming through those slits will make a wave form, and the two wave forms will begin to interfere with each other. So that light, yes, is a wave, but why, if you split the wave, would it produce an interference pattern? And only just now, in the spring of 2014, the experiment was done again on the nanoscale with gold particles. And with a single gold particle as the, quote, slit reproduction, light wave has its beautiful symmetry, and its waveforms are given here in diagram. It looks like an angelic spread of wings going dynamically forth. Whereas if there are two gold nanoparticles, even if they're overlapping, you get an interference pattern which is crippled. You don't get the angelic wings dynamically soaring at all. This has to do with high dharma. This has to do with the mind. That when the mind is open, you get the angelic wing pattern soaring. When the mind becomes opaque because of a backing, like putting silver to glass. Now, that portion of the glass becomes mirror. And the more mirror that it is, the more that there's an interference until you complete the glazing of the window. And then you have a complete mirror. And what the complete mirror shows is a reflection of yourself. A reflection of exactly what is seeable through that mirror, wherever it is facing. And that this is the whole basis of identification. This is the whole logical construct, taproot of the hubris and the stupidity